The Life of Agis and Kleomenes by Plutarch, translated by Aubrey Stewart. Many writers have very naturally conceived that the myth of Ixion, who is fabled to have embraced a cloud instead of Hera, and so to have begotten the Centaurs, is really typical of ambitious men. For although they aim at obtaining glory, and set before themselves a lofty ideal of virtue, yet they never succeed in producing any very distinct result, because all their actions are colored by various human passions and prejudices, just as the herdsmen with their flocks say in Sophocles' play. We needs must serve them, though their lords we be, and to their mute commands obedience pay. These verses really represent the state of those who, in order to obtain the empty title of statesmen and popular leaders, govern a country by following the caprices and impulses of the people. Just as the men stationed in the bows of a ship see what is coming before the steersman, but yet look up to them as their chiefs and execute their orders, so they who govern with a view solely to their own popularity, although they may be called rulers, are, in truth, nothing more than slaves of the people. An absolutely perfect man would not even wish for popularity, except so far as it enabled him to take part in politics, and caused him to be trusted by the people. Yet a young and ambitious man must be excused if he feels pride in the glory and reputation which he gains by brilliant exploits. For, as Theophrastus says, the virtue which buds and sprouts in youthful minds is confirmed by praise, and the high spirit thus formed leads it to attempt greater things. On the other hand, an excessive love of praise is dangerous in all cases, but in statesmen utterly ruinous. For when it takes hold of men in the possession of great power, it drives them to commit acts of sheer madness, because they forgot that honorable conduct must increase their popularity, and think that any measure that increases their popularity must necessarily be a good one. We ought to tell the people that they cannot have the same man to lead them and to follow them, just as Phocion is said to have replied to Antipater when he demanded some disgraceful service from him. I cannot be Antipater's friend and his toady at the same time. One might also quote the fable of the serpent's tail, which murmured against the head, and desired sometimes to take the lead, and not always follow the head, but which, when allowed to lead the way, took the wrong path, and caused the head to be miserably crushed, because it allowed itself to be guided by that which could neither see nor hear. This has been the fate of many of those politicians who court the favor of the people, for after they have once shared their blind impulses, they lose the power of checking their folly, and of restoring good discipline and order. These reflections upon the favor of the people occurred to me when I thought of its power, as shown in the case of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, men who were well born, educated, and began their political career with great promise, and yet were ruined, not so much by an excessive craving for popular applause as by a very pardonable fear of disgrace. They both received at the outset great proofs of their countrymen's goodwill, but felt ashamed to remain as it were in their debt, and they ever strove to wipe out their obligations to the people by legislation on their behalf, and by their beneficent measures continually increase their popularity, until, in the heat of the rivalry thus created, they found themselves pledged to a line of policy in which they could not even pause with honor, and which they could not desist from without disgrace. The reader, however, will be able to form his own opinion about them from their history, and I shall now write, as a parallel to them, the lives of that pair of Laconian reformers, Agis and Kleomenes, kings of Sparta, who, like the Gracchi, increased the power of the people, and endeavored to restore an admirable and just constitution which had fallen into desuetude, but who, like them, incurred the hatred of the governing class, who were unwilling to relinquish their encroachments and privileges. These Lacedaemonians were not indeed brothers, yet they pursued a kindred policy, with the same objects in view. After the desire for silver and gold had penetrated into Sparta, the acquisition of wealth produced greed and meanness, while the use and enjoyment of riches was followed by luxury, effeminacy, and extravagance. Thus it fell out that Sparta lost her high and honored position in Greece, and remained in obscurity and disgrace until the reign of Agis and Leonidas. Agis was of the Eurypontid line, the son of Eudamidas, and the sixth in descent from King Agesilaus, who invaded Asia and became the most powerful man in Greece. This Agesilaus had a son named Archidamus, who fell in battle against the Messapians at the battle of Mendurium in Italy. He was succeeded by his eldest son Agis, who, being killed by Antipater near Megalopolis, and leaving no issue, was succeeded by his brother Eudamidas, he by a son named Archidamus, and Archidamus by another Eudamidas, the father of Agis, the subject of this memoir. Leonidas, the son of Kleomenes, was of the other royal family, that of the Agiadae, and was eighth in descent from Pausanias, who conquered Mardonius at the battle of Plataea. Pausanias had a son named Pleistoanax, whose son was again named Pausanias. This Pausanias fled for his life from Sparta to Tegea, and was succeeded by his eldest son, Agesipolis, and he, dying childless, by his younger brother, Cleombrotus. Cleombrotus left two sons, Agesipolis and Kleomenes, of whom Agesipolis reigned but a short time, and left no children. Kleomenes succeeded his brother Agesipolis on the throne. Of his two sons, the elder, Acrotatus, died during his father's lifetime, and the younger, Cleomenes, never reigned, as the throne was occupied by Arius, the son of Kleomenes and the son of Acrotatus. Arius perished in battle before Corinth, and was succeeded by his son Acrotatus. This Acrotatus was defeated and slain near the city of Megalopolis by the despot Aristodemus, leaving his wife pregnant. When she bore a son, Leonidas, the son of Cleomenes, was appointed his guardian, and as the child died before reaching manhood, he succeeded to the throne, although he was far from being an acceptable personage to his countrymen. For though the Spartans at this period had all abandoned their original severe simplicity of living, yet they found the manners of Leonidas in offensive contrast to their own. Indeed, Leonidas, who had spent much of his life at the courts of Asiatic potentates, and had been especially attached to that of Seleucus, seemed inclined to outrage the political feeling of the Greeks by introducing the arrogant tone of an Oriental despot into the constitutional monarchy of Sparta. On the other hand, the goodness of heart and intellectual power of Agis proved so greatly superior not only to that of Leonidas, but of every king since Agesilaus the Great, that before he arrived at his 20th year, in spite of his having been brought up in the greatest luxury by his mother Agesistrata and his grandmother Archidamia, the two richest women in Sparta, he abjured all frivolous indulgence, laid aside all personal ornament, avoided extravagance of every kind, prided himself on practicing the old Laconian habits of dress, food, and bathing, and was wont to say that he would not care to be king unless he could use his position to restore the ancient customs and discipline of his country. The corruption of the Lacedaemonians began at the time when, after having overthrown the Athenian empire, they were able to satiate themselves with the possession of gold and silver. Nevertheless, as the number of houses instituted by Lycurgus was still maintained, and each father still transmitted his estate to his son, the original equal division of property continued to exist, and preserved the state from disorder. But a certain powerful and self-willed man named Epitadius, who was one of the ephors, having quarrelled with his son, produced a rhetra permitting a man to give his house and land to whomsoever he pleased, either during his life or by his will after his death. This man proposed the law in order to gratify his own private grudge, but the other Spartans, through covetousness, eagerly confirmed it, and ruined the admirable constitution of Lycurgus. They now began to acquire land without limit, as the powerful men kept their relatives out of their rightful inheritance, and as the wealth of the country soon got into the hands of a few, the city became impoverished, and the rich began to be viewed with dislike and hatred. There were left at that time no more than 700 Spartans, and of these about 100 possessed an inheritance in land, while the rest, without money and excluded from all the privileges of citizenship, fought in a languid and spiritless fashion in the wars, and were ever on the watch for some opportunity to subvert the existing condition of affairs at home. Agis, therefore, thinking that it would be an honorable enterprise, as indeed it was, to restore these citizens to the state, and to re-establish equality for all, began to sound the people themselves as to their opinion about such a measure. The younger men quickly rallied round him, and with an enthusiasm which he had hardly counted upon, began to make ready for the contest. But most of the elder men, who had become more thoroughly tainted by the prevailing corruption, feared to be brought back to the discipline of Lycurgus as much as a runaway slave fears to be brought back to his master, and they bitterly reviled Agis when he lamented over the condition of affairs and sighed for the ancient glories of Sparta. His enthusiastic aspirations, however, were sympathized with by Lysander, the son of Lebus, Mandroclitus, the son of Epiphanes, and Agesilaus. Lysander was the most influential of all the Spartans, while Mandroclitus was thought to be the ablest politician in Greece, as he could both plot with subtlety and execute with boldness. Agesilaus was the uncle of King Agis, and a fluent speaker, but of a weak and covetous disposition. It was commonly supposed that he was stirred to action by the influence of his son Hippomedon, who had gained great glory in the wars, and was exceedingly popular among the younger citizens. But what really determined him to join the reformers was the amount of his debts, which he hoped would be wiped out by a revolution. As soon as Agis had won over his important adherent, he began to try to bring over his mother to his views, who was Agesilaus's sister, and who, from the number of her friends, debtors, and dependents, was very powerful in the state, and took a large share in the management of public affairs. When she first heard of Agis's designs, she was much startled, and dissuaded the youth from an enterprise which she thought neither practicable nor desirable. However, when Agesilaus pointed out to her what a notable design it was, and how greatly to the advantage of all, while the young king himself besought his mother to part with her wealth in order to gain him glory, arguing that he could not vie with other kings in riches, as the servants of Persian satraps, and the very slaves of the intendants of Ptolemy and Seleucus, possessed more money than all the kings that ever reigned in Sparta, but that if he could prove himself superior to those vanities by his temperance, simplicity of life, and true greatness of mind, and could succeed in restoring equality among his fellow countrymen, he would be honored and renowned as a truly great king. By this means the youth entirely changed his mother's mind, and so fired her with his own ambition, as if by an inspiration from heaven, that she began to encourage Agis and urge him on, and invited her friends to join them, while she also communicated their designs to the other women, because she knew that the Lacedaemonians were in all things ruled by their women, and that they had more power in the state than the men possessed in their private households. Most of the wealth of Lacedaemon had fallen into female hands at this time, and this fact proved a great hindrance to the accomplishments of Agis's schemes of reform. For the women offered a vehement opposition to him, not merely through a vulgar love for their idolized luxury, but also because they saw that they would lose all the influence and power which they derived from their wealth. They betook themselves to Leonidas, and besought him, as being the elder man, to restrain Agis and check the development of his designs. Leonidas was willing enough to assist the richer class, but he feared the people, who were eager for reform, and would not openly oppose Agis, although he endeavored secretly to ruin his scheme, and to prejudice the ephors against him, by imputing to him the design of hiring the poor to make him despot with the plunder of the rich, and insinuating that by his redistribution of lands and remission of debts, he meant to obtain more adherents for himself instead of more citizens for Sparta. In spite of all this, Agis contrived to get Lysander appointed one of the ephors, and immediately brought him to propose a rhetra before the Gerousia, or Senate, the main points of which were that all debts should be cancelled, that the land should be divided, that between the valley of Pellene and Mount Taygetus, Mallia and Cilicia, into 4,500 lots, and the outlying districts into 15,000. That the latter district should be distributed among the Perioeci of military age, and the former among the pure Spartans. That the number of these should be made up by an extension of the franchise to Perioeci, or even foreigners of free birth, liberal education, and fitting personal qualifications, and that these citizens should be divided into 15 companies, some of 400 and some of 200 for the public meals, and should conform in every respect to the discipline of their forefathers. When this rhetra was proposed, as the Senate could not agree whether it should become law, Lysander convoked a popular assembly, and himself addressed the people. Mandroclides and Agesilaus also besought them not to allow a few selfish voluptuaries to destroy the glorious name of Sparta, but to remember the ancient oracles, warning them against the sin of covetousness, which would prove the ruin of Sparta, and also of the responses which they had recently received from the oracle of Pasiphae. The temple and oracle of Pasiphae at Thelemae was of peculiar sanctity. Pasiphae is said by some writers to have been one of the daughters of Atlas, and to have become the mother of Ammon by Zeus, while others say that Cassandra, the daughter of Priam, died there, and was called Pasiphae because her prophecies were plain to all men. Philarchus again tells us that Daphne, the daughter of Amyclus, while endeavoring to escape from the violence of Apollo, was transformed into the laurel which bears her name, and was honored by the god, and endowed by him with the gift of prophecy. Be this as it may, the oracular responses which were brought from this shrine bade the Spartans all become equal, according as Lycurgus had originally ordained. After these speeches had been delivered, King Agis himself came forward, and after a few introductory words, said that he was giving the strongest possible pledges of his loyalty to the new constitution, for he declared his intention of surrendering to the state, before anyone else, his own property, consisting of a vast extent of land, both arable and pasture, besides 6,000 talents of money. And he assured the people that his mother and her friends, the richest people in Sparta, would do the same. The people were astounded at the magnanimity of the youth, and were filled with joy, thinking that, at last, after an interval of 300 years, there had appeared a king worthy of Sparta. Leonidas, on the other hand, opposed him as vigorously as he could, reflecting that he would be forced to follow his example, and divest himself of all his property, and that Agis, not he, would get the credit of the act. He therefore inquired of Agis whether he thought Lycurgus to have been a just and well-meaning man. Receiving an affirmative reply, he again demanded, "Where, then, do we find that Lycurgus approved of the cancelling of debts, or of the admission of foreigners to the franchise, seeing that he did not think that the state could prosper without a periodical expulsion of foreigners?" To this Agis answered that it was not to be wondered at if Leonidas, who had lived in a foreign country and had a family by the daughter of a Persian satrap, should be ignorant that Lycurgus, together with coined money, had banished borrowing and lending from Sparta, and that he had no hatred for foreigners, but only for those whose profession and mode of life made them unfit to associate with his countrymen. These men Lycurgus expelled, not from any hatred of their persons, but because he feared that their manners and habits would infect the citizens with a love of luxury, effeminacy, and avarice. Terpander, Thales, and Pherecydes were all foreigners, but since they sang and taught what Lycurgus approved, they lived in Sparta and were treated with especial honor. "Do you," asked he, "praise Ecprepus, who when Ephor cut off with a hatchet the 2 additional strings which Phrynis the musician had added to the original 7 strings of the lyre, and those who cut the same strings off the harp of Timotheus? And yet do you blame us when we are endeavoring to get rid of luxury, extravagance, and frivolity, just as if those great men did not merely mean thereby to guard against vain refinements of music, which would lead to the introduction of extravagant and licentious manners, and cause the city to be at discord and variance with itself?" After this, the people espoused the cause of Agis, while the rich begged Leonidas not to desert them, and by their entreaties prevailed upon the senators, who had the power of originating all laws, to throw out the rhetra by a majority of only 1 vote. Lysander, who was still one of the ephors, now proceeded to attack Leonidas by means of a certain ancient law which forbade any descendant of Heracles to beget children by a foreign wife, and which bade the Spartans put to death any citizen who left his country to dwell in a foreign land. He instructed his adherents to revive the memory of this law and threaten Leonidas with its penalties, while he himself with the other ephors watched for the sign from heaven. This ceremony is conducted as follows. Every 9th year the ephors choose a clear moonless night, and sit in silence watching the heavens. If a star shoots across the sky, they conclude that the kings must have committed some act of impiety, and they suspend them from their office until they were absolved by a favorable oracle from Delphi or Olympia. Lysander now declared that he had beheld this sign, and impeached Leonidas, bringing forward witnesses to prove that he had 2 children born to him by an Asiatic wife, the daughter of one of the lieutenants of Seleucus, and that having quarrelled with his wife, and become hated by her, he had unexpectedly returned home, and in default of a direct heir, had succeeded to the throne. At the same time, Lysander urged Cleombrotus, the son-in-law of Leonidas, who was also of the royal family, to claim the throne for himself. Leonidas, terrified at this, took sanctuary in the temple of Athena of the Brazen House, and was joined there by his daughter, who left her husband Cleombrotus. When the trial came on, Leonidas did not appear in court. He was removed from the throne, and Cleombrotus was appointed in his stead. At this crisis, Lysander was forced to lay down his office, as the year for which he had been elected had expired. The ephors at once took Leonidas under their protection, restored him to the throne, and impeached Lysander and Mandroclides as the authors of illegal measures in the cancelling of debts and the redistribution of land. As these men were now in danger of their lives, they prevailed upon the 2 kings to act together and overrule the decision of the ephors. For this, they declared, was the ancient rule of the constitution, that if the kings were at variance, the ephors were entitled to support the one whom they judged to be in the right against the other, but their function was merely to act as arbitrators and judges between the kings when they disagreed, and not to interfere with them when they were of one mind. Both the kings agreed to act upon this advice, and came with their friends into the assembly, turned the ephors out of their chairs of office, and elected others in their room, one of whom was Agesilaus. They now armed many of the younger citizens, released the prisoners, and terrified their opponents by threatening a general massacre. No one, however, was killed by them, for although Agesilaus desired to kill Leonidas, and when he withdrew from Sparta to Tegea, sent men to waylay and murder him on the road, Agis, hearing of his intention, sent others on whom he could rely, who escorted Leonidas safely as far as Tegea. Thus far all had gone well, and no one remained to hinder the accomplishment of the reforms. But now Agesilaus alone upset and ruined the whole of this noble and truly Spartan scheme by his detestable vice of covetousness. He possessed a large quantity of the best land in the country, and also owed a great sum of money, and as he desired neither to pay his debts nor to part with his land, he persuaded Agis that it would be too revolutionary a proceeding to carry both measures at once, and that, if the moneyed class were first propitiated by the cancelling of debts, they would afterwards be inclined to submit quietly to the redistribution of lands. Lysander and the rest were deceived by Agesilaus into consenting to this, and they brought all the written securities for money which had been given by debtors, which are called by them claria, into the marketplace, and collected them into one heap and burned them. As the flames rose, the rich and those who had lent money went away in great distress, but Agesilaus, as if exulting at their misfortune, declared that he had never seen a brighter blaze or a purer fire. As the people at once demanded the division of the land, and called upon the kings to distribute it among them, Agesilaus put them off with various excuses, and managed to spin out the time till Agis was sent out of the country on military service, as the Achaeans, who were allies, had demanded a reinforcement from Sparta, because the Aetolians threatened to invade Peloponnesus through the territory of Megara, and Aratus, the general of the Achaeans, who was collecting an army to resist them, sent to Sparta demanding assistance. The Spartans at once dispatched Agis as the head of the army, whose high spirits and devotions to his person filled him with delight. The men were nearly all young and poor, and as they were now relieved from the pressure of their debts, and expected that on their return the land would be distributed among them, they behaved with the most admirable discipline. They marched through Peloponnesus without doing the least damage, without offending anyone, almost without noise, so that all the cities were astonished at the spectacle thus afforded them, and men began to wonder what a Lacedaemonian army must have been like when led by Agesilaus or Lysander the Great, or by the ancient hero Leonidas, if such awe and reverence was paid by the soldiers to one who was nearly the youngest of them all. Their youthful leader himself was worthy of admiration, and was looked up to by the men because of his simple, hard-working habits, and the pride which he took in wearing the same dress, and using the same arms as the common soldiers. The revolution which he had effected, however, was very distasteful to the rich, who feared lest it might be taken as an example by the people in other states, and lead to further disturbances. Agis joined Aratus at Corinth, while the question of how to repel the invasion was still being debated. His advice was spirited, without being rash or foolhardy. He gave it as his opinion that it was their duty to fight, and not abandon the gate of Peloponnesus, and let the army into the country, but that he would defer to the decision of Aratus, who was an older man than himself, and was the general of the Achaeans, and that he had not come to give them advice or to take the command of them, but to reinforce them and serve as their ally. The historian Baton of Sinope declares that Agis declined to fight, although Aratus wished him to do so. But he is mistaken, and clearly has not read the justification which Aratus has written of his conduct, namely, that as the farmers had nearly all finished gathering in their harvest, he thought it better to allow the enemy to enter the country than to hazard everything upon the issue of a single battle. As Aratus decided not to fight, and dismissed his allies with thanks, Agis returned home, greatly honored by those under his orders, and found the internal affairs of Sparta in great turmoil and confusion. Agesilaus, who is now Ephor, and who is no longer restrained by the presence of those of whom he had formerly stood in awe, was using the most disgraceful expedients to extort money from the people, and had even intercalated a 13th month in the year, although the state of the calendar did not require it, and caused taxes to be paid for it. As he feared those whom he had wronged, and was an object of universal hatred, he had taken a bodyguard of swordsmen into his pay, and walked through the city accompanied by them. As for the kings, he regarded Cleombrotus with contempt, and though he still paid some respect to Agis, he wished it to be thought that he did so because he was nearly related to himself, not because he was king. He also gave out that he intended to remain in office as Ephor for the next year as well. In consequence of this, his enemies determined to bring matters to a crisis. They assembled in force, brought back Leonidas publicly from Tegea, and reinstated him as king, to the great joy of most of the citizens, who were angry with the other party because they had been deceived by them about the redistribution of the land. Agesilaus was able to leave the country in safety, owing to the intercession of his son Hippomedon, who was very popular with all classes on account of his bravery. Of the two kings, Agis fled to the temple of Athena of the Brazen House, while Cleombrotus took sanctuary in the temple of Poseidon. It appears that Leonidas hated Cleombrotus most of the two, for he passed by Agis, but marched in pursuit of Cleombrotus with an armed force, and angrily reproached him that being his own son-in-law, he had conspired against him, dethroned him, and driven him into exile. Cleombrotus could find nothing to say in his defense, and sat silent and helpless. But Kleomenes, the daughter of Leonidas, who formerly had taken offense at her father's injurious treatment, and when Cleombrotus usurped the throne had left him, and showed her sympathy with Leonidas in his misfortune by accompanying him in the temple where he took sanctuary, and after he left the country by mourning for him, and remaining at variance with her husband Cleombrotus, now changed sides with his changing fortunes, and appeared sitting by her husband's side as a suppliant to the god with him, with her arms cast round him, and her two children on each side of her. All stood amazed, and were moved to tears by her noble and affectionate conduct, and she, pointing to her mean dress and dishevelled hair, said, "Father, I have not adopted this posture and this dress out of pity for Cleombrotus, but I have so long been in mourning for your misfortunes and your banishment that it has become customary with me. Am I now to remain in mourning while you are victorious and reign in Sparta? Or am I to dress myself in fine clothes as becomes a princess, while I see my husband murdered by your hand? Unless we can move you to compassion, and obtain your pity by the tears of his wife and children, he will suffer a more terrible penalty for his misconduct than you wish to impose, by seeing me, his dearest wife, die before him. For how can I endure to live among other women, if I prove unable to move either my husband or my father to compassion? Both as a wife and as a daughter I have been fated to suffer with my own kin, and to be despised with them. If there is anything which can be urged on behalf of my husband's conduct, I have made it impossible to plead it for him by the part which I have taken in protesting against his conduct to you. But you yourself suggest a sufficient apology for his crime, by showing that you think royalty so great and precious a thing, that to obtain it you are willing to murder your son-in-law and neglect your own child." Kleomenes, after speaking thus, nestled her face against that of her husband, and glanced round at the spectators with red and tearful eyes. Leonidas, after a short consultation with his friends, bade Cleombrotus rise and leave the country, but besought his daughter to remain with him, and not to leave him who loved her so dearly, and had just spared her husband's life in consequence of her entreaties. He could not, however, prevail upon her to stay, but she rose up with her husband, took one child in her arms, and led the other, and so, after kneeling before the altar, followed her husband, who, if his mind was not entirely corrupted by vain ambition, must have thought exile with such a wife preferable to royalty. After driving Cleombrotus from the throne, rejecting the ephors from office, and substituting others chosen by himself, Leonidas addressed himself to Agis. At first he tried to persuade him to come out of sanctuary and reign as his colleague, saying that the citizens had forgiven him, because they knew that he was young and impetuous, and had been deceived by Agesilaus. However, as Agis saw through these devices and remained where he was, Leonidas left off making these hypocritical offers. Amphares, Demochares, and Arcesilaus were in the habit of going to the temple and conversing with him, and once he came out of the temple in their company to take a bath, and after bathing was conducted back again by them in safety. All three were on intimate terms with him, but Amphares, who had lately borrowed some rich clothing and valuable plate from Agesistrata, was inclined to plot against the king and the royal ladies, that he might not be obliged to restore them. He therefore, we are told, lent a ready ear to Leonidas's plans, and excited the zeal of the ephors, one of whom he was. Since Agis lived entirely in the temple, and only left it in order to bathe, they determined to seize him when he came out for this purpose. Having one day watched him bathing, they came up and greeted him in a friendly way, and walked along with him talking and jesting as young men who are on intimate terms are wont to do. When they reached the place where a road branches off to the public prison, Amphares, in virtue of his ephorship, laid hold of Agis and said, "Agis, I must lead you before the ephors to give an account of your conduct." At the same time, Demochares, a tall and strong man, threw his cloak round Agis's neck and dragged him along by it. Others now appeared by previous arrangement and pushed him from behind, and as no one came to help him, he was forced into the prison. Hereupon Leonidas appeared with a band of mercenaries and surrounded the prison. The ephors now went into Agis and sent for all the senators of their way of thinking to come to the prison in order to go through the form of a trial. Agis laughed at their hypocrisy, but Amphares told him that it was no laughing matter, and that he would soon pay a bitter penalty for his rashness. Another of the ephors, wishing to offer a means of escape to Agis, inquired of him whether he had acted on his own responsibility, or had been compelled to do so by Agesilaus and Lysander. Agis answered that no man had compelled him, but that he admired and imitated Lycurgus, and had aimed at reviving his institutions. Upon this the same ephor asked him whether he repented of what he had done. When the brave youth answered that he would never repent of his glorious designs, whatever tortures he might have to suffer for them, the assembly at once condemned him to death, and bade the prison officials at once remove him to the place called Decus, which is a part of the prison in which criminals are strangled. Seeing that the servants would not lay hands upon Agis, and that even those mercenaries who were present shrunk from such work, because it was held to be unlawful and impious to lay hands upon the person of the king, Demochares, after threatening and abusing them, dragged Agis with his own hands to the place of execution. Many of the citizens had by this time heard of his arrest, and many men had assembled with torches in their hands, and were clamoring at the gate of the prison. The mother and grandmother of Agis were also present, and loudly demanded that the king of Sparta should have a fair trial in the presence of his countrymen. For this reason they within hurried on the execution, as they feared that if a larger crowd collected Agis would be rescued during the night. While Agis was being led to execution, he saw one of the servants of the prison weeping and in great distress. "My man," said he, "do not weep for me, for I am a better man than those who are murdering me in this cruel and illegal fashion." With these words he, of his own accord, put the noose round his neck. Meanwhile, Amphares proceeded to the prison gate. Here Agesistrata fell at his feet, believing him still to be her friend. Amphares raised her, saying that Agis would suffer no violent treatment, and bade her, if she wished, go in and see her son. As she asked to be accompanied by her mother, Amphares said that there was no objection to that, and after receiving them both within the walls, ordered the prison gates to be closed. He first sent Archidamia, who was now very old, and greatly respected by her countrywoman, to the place of execution, and when she was dead, bade Agesistrata enter. When she saw the corpse of her son laying on the ground, and her mother hanging by a halter, she herself assisted the servants to take her down, laid her body beside that of Agis, and arranged and covered up the two corpses. She then knelt and kissed the face of her son, saying, "My child, thy great piety, goodness, and clemency has brought thee and us to this death." Upon this Amphares, who was watching and listening at the door, came into the room and said angrily to Agesistrata, "If you approve of your son's deeds, you shall suffer with him." At these words Agesistrata rose and offered her neck to the halter, saying, "I only pray that this may be for the good of Sparta." When the sad news was known throughout the city, and the three corpses brought out of the prison, the terror which was inspired did not prevent the citizens from manifesting their sorrow at the deed, and their hatred of Leonidas and Amphares. No such wicked or cruel deed, they declared, had been committed in Sparta since the Dorians settled in Peloponnesus. The very enemies of the Lacedaemonians generally seemed unwilling to lay violent hands on their kings when they met them in battle, and turned aside through reverence of their exalted position. For this reason, in all the battles which the Lacedaemonians had fought against the Greeks before the era of Philip of Macedon, only one king, Cleombrotus, had fallen on the field of Leuctra. For though the Messenians aver that Theopompus, a king of Lacedaemon, was slain by Aristomenes, the Lacedaemonians deny it, and say that he was only wounded. This matter is doubtful, but Agis was the first king who was put to death by the Ephors in Lacedaemon, because he had conceived a noble design, and one which was worthy of Sparta. He was of an age when men's shortcomings deserve to be pardoned, and deserves to be blamed by his friends more than by his enemies, because with an ill-judged clemency he spared the life of Leonidas, and trusted in the professions of the rest of his political enemies. After the death of Agis, as has been related, Leonidas was not able to seize the person of his brother Archidamus, who had once fled out of the country, but he brought the wife of Agis with her newly born child out of her house, and forcibly married her to his own son Kleomenes, who was scarcely come to an age for marriage, because he was unwilling for her to marry anyone else. Indeed, Agiatis was the daughter of Gylippus, and heiress to a great estate. She was thought to be the most beautiful woman of her time in all Greece, and was of a noble disposition. It is said that she made many entreaties not to be forced into a second marriage, but that after her union with Kleomenes, although she continued to hate his father, Leonidas, she made a good and affectionate wife to the young man, who became passionately fond of her, and sympathized with her loving remembrance of Agis, so that he would often ask her to tell him about her late husband, and used to listen with rapt attention while she explained the designs and projects of Agis. For Cleomenes was as eager for honor, and had as noble a mind as Agis himself, and was equally moderate and simple in his way of life, but he lacked the other's discreet and gentle temper, and was of a stirring and vehement nature, eager to embark on any honorable enterprise. He thought it the most glorious position of all to rule over an obedient people, but he took pride also in bending disobedient subjects to his will, and forcibly compelling them to move in the path of honor. He was far from satisfied with the state of things at Sparta, where the citizens had given themselves up to luxurious repose, while the king Leonidas cared nothing for public affairs, so long as he was able to gratify his own love of extravagance and self-indulgence. Public virtue was entirely gone, and no man cared to profit his country, but only himself. As for discipline, orderly training of the young, hardiness of body, and equality, all these things had perished with Agis, and it was not safe even to speak of them. We are told that, while yet a lad, Cleomenes was instructed in the principles of the Stoic philosophy by Spherus of Borysthenes, who visited Lacedaemon and gave excellent instruction there to the young. This Spherus was one of the aptest pupils of Zeno of Citium, and he seems to have admired the manly spirit of Cleomenes, and to have encouraged him in the pursuit of honor. The ancient hero Leonidas, when asked what he thought of Tertius, is said to have answered, "He is good at exciting the minds of the youth." Indeed, they became filled with enthusiasm by the poems of Tertius, and fought with reckless daring in battle. And so also the Stoic philosophy often renders brave and fiery natures over-daring and venturesome, and yields the best fruit when applied to a grave and gentle nature. When, after the death of Leonidas, Cleomenes succeeded to the throne, he found the state utterly disorganized, for the rich took no part in politics, and cared for nothing but their own pleasure and profit, while the miserable condition of the poor caused them to fight without spirit in the wars, and to neglect the proper training of their children. He himself was a king only in name, as the ephors had engrossed all real power. Under these circumstances, he at once began to revolve schemes of reform in his mind, and began to sound the opinion of his intimate friend Xenares, by inquiring of him what sort of a king Agis had been, and in what manner, and with what associates he had made his attempts at reform. Xenares at first very willingly gave him a complete narrative of the whole transaction, but as he saw that Cleomenes listened with intense interest, and was deeply excited by the recital of Agis's designs, to which he was never weary of listening, Xenares at last angrily reproached him with not being in his right mind, and at last broke off all intercourse with him. He did not, however, tell anyone the reason of their being at variance, but declared that Cleomenes knew well what it was. Cleomenes, after meeting with this rebuff from Xenares, imagined that everyone else would be of the same mind, determined to concert his own measures alone. As he thought that there was more chance of effecting reforms during war than in time of peace, he involved Sparta in a war with the Achaeans, for which they themselves furnished the pretext. Aratus, the chief of the Achaeans, had always desired to unite the whole of the Peloponnesus in one confederacy, and in all his long political career had steadily kept this object in view, as he thought that thus, and thus alone, the people of Peloponnesus would be able to defend themselves against external foes. Nearly all the tribes of Peloponnesus joined his confederacy, except the Lacedaemonians, the people of Elis, and such of the Arcadians as were under Lacedaemonian influence. On the death of Leonidas, Aratus began to make plundering expeditions into the territory of the Arcadians, especially those near the Achaean frontier, in order to see what steps the Lacedaemonians would take, for he despised Cleomenes as a young and inexperienced man. Upon this the ephors first sent Cleomenes to occupy the temple of Athena near Belbina. This place was situated in a mountain pass leading into Laconia, and it was claimed by the citizens of Megalopolis as belonging to their territory. Cleomenes seized the pass and fortified it, to which Aratus offered no objection, but endeavored by a night march to surprise the cities of Tegea and Orchomenes. However, the hearts of the traders within the walls failed them, and so Aratus led his army back, hoping that his object had not been discovered. Cleomenes, by way of jest, now wrote him a letter affecting to inquire of him in the most friendly terms where he had been in the night. He answered that he had heard that Cleomenes was about to erect fortifications at Belbina, and had marched to prevent his doing so. To this Cleomenes answered that he was satisfied that this had been Aratus's intention, but, he continued, if you do not mind, please tell me why you brought scaling ladders and torches with you. Aratus laughed at this home thrust, and inquired what sort of youth Cleomenes might be. Demochares, the Lacedaemonian exile, answered, if you mean to do anything against the Lacedaemonians, you must make haste, and do it before this young cub's spurs are grown. After this the Ephors ordered Cleomenes, who was encamped in Arcadia with a few horsemen and 300 foot, to retire, as they feared to go to war. But since, as soon as he had withdrawn, Aratus captured the city of Caphae, they sent him back again. He captured Methydrium and overran Argolis, upon which the Achaeans sent an army of 20,000 foot and 1,000 horse, under the command of Aristomachus, to attack him. Cleomenes met them near Pallanteum, and was eager to fight, but Aratus, alarmed at his daring, would not permit the Achaean general to fight, and drew off his forces, incurring thereby the anger of the Achaeans, and the ridicule and contempt of the Lacedaemonians, who only amounted to 1/5 of the enemy's numbers. This affair gave Cleomenes great self-confidence, and parodying a saying of one of the ancient kings, he said to his countrymen that it was useless nowadays for the Lacedaemonians to ask either how many their enemies were, or where they were. Shortly after, as the Achaeans were making war against the Eleans, Cleomenes was sent to aid the latter, and met with the army of the Achaeans returning home, near the mountain called Lycaeum. He attacked their forces and utterly routed them, killing many and capturing numbers of prisoners, so that a report spread throughout Greece that Aratus himself had perished. But Aratus, turning the disaster to good account, immediately after the defeat marched to Mantinea, and as no one expected him, captured the city and placed a strong garrison in it. This completely disheartened the Lacedaemonians, who desired to recall Cleomenes and put an end to the war. Cleomenes now sent to Messene, and invited back Archidamus, the brother of Agis, who ought to have been on the throne as the representative of the other royal family, imagining that if there were two kings reigning at Sparta at the same time, the power of the Ephors would be weakened. However, the party who had previously murdered Agis perceived this, and as they feared that if Archidamus returned to Sparta he would make them pay the penalty of their crimes, they welcomed him back, and assisted him to make a secret entry into the city, but immediately afterwards assassinated him, either against the will of Cleomenes, as we are told by Philarchus, or else with his connivance, in consequence of the representations of his friends. They indeed bore the chief blame in the matter, as they were thought to have forced Cleomenes into consenting to the murder. Cleomenes, determined to carry out his designs of reform, now proceeded to bribe the Ephors into sending him out on a new military expedition. He also won over a considerable number of supporters among the citizens by means of the lavish expenditure and influence of his mother, Cratesicalia, who, though averse to a second marriage, is said to have married one of the leading men in Sparta in order to further her son's interests. Cleomenes now took the field at the head of his army, and captured a small town within the territory of Megalopolis, named Leuctra. The Achaeans under Aratus promptly came up, and a battle was fought under the walls of the town, in which the part of the army of Cleomenes was defeated. Aratus, however, refused to follow up his advantage, and kept the main body of the Achaeans motionless behind the bed of a torrent. Enraged at his inaction, Lydiades of Megalopolis charged at the head of the cavalry under his own command, but got entangled in this pursuit of the enemy in ground which was cut up by walls and watercourses. Seeing him thrown into disorder, Cleomenes sent his Tarentine and Cretan troops to attack him, by whom Lydiades, fighting bravely, was overpowered and slain. The Lacedaemonians now recovered their spirits, and with loud shouts attacked the Achaeans and completely defeated them. Many were slain, and their corpses were given up to the enemy for burial, with the exception of that of Lydiades, which Cleomenes ordered to be brought to himself. He then attired it in a purple robe, placed a garland upon its head, and sent it to the city of Megalopolis. This was that Lydiades who had been despot of Megalopolis, but who abdicated his throne, restored liberty to his countrymen, and brought the city to join the Achaean League. After this victory, Kleomenes became inspired with fresh confidence, and was convinced that if he only were allowed undisputed management, he would easily conquer the Achaeans. He explained to his stepfather, Megisthenes, that the time had come at length for the abolition of the ephors, the redistribution of property, and the establishment of equality among the citizens, after which Sparta might again aspire to recover her ancient ascendancy in Greece. Megisthenes agreed, and communicated his intentions to 2 or 3 of his friends. It chanced that at this time one of the ephors who was sleeping in the temple of Pasiphae dreamed an extraordinary dream, that in the place where the ephors sat for the dispatch of business, he saw 4 chairs removed, and one alone remaining, while as he wondered, he heard a voice from the shrine say, "This is best for Sparta." When the ephor related this dream to Kleomenes, he was at first much alarmed, and feared that the man had conceived some suspicion of his designs, but finding that he was really in earnest, recovered his confidence. Taking with him all those citizens whom he suspected to be opposed to his enterprise, he captured Heraea and Alcea, cities belonging to the Achaean League, revictualled Orchomenus, and threatened Mantinea. By long marches and countermarches, he so wearied the Lacedaemonians that at last, at their own request, he left the greater part of them in Arcadia, while he with the mercenaries returned to Sparta. During his homeward march, he revealed his intentions to those whom he considered to be most devoted to his person, and regulated his march so as to be able to fall upon the ephors while they were at their evening meal. When he drew near the city, he sent Euryclides into the dining room of the ephors, on the pretense of bringing a message from the army. After Euryclides followed Phoebus and Tharukion, 2 of the foster brothers of Kleomenes, called Mathakes by the Lacedaemonians, with a few soldiers. While the Euryclides was parleying with the ephors, these men rushed in with drawn swords and cut them down. The president, Agis, fell at the first blow, and appeared to be dead, but contrived to crawl out of the building unobserved into a small temple, sacred to Fear, the door of which was usually closed, but which then chanced to be open. In this he took refuge, and shut the door. The other 4 were slain, and some few persons, not more than 10, who came to assist them. No one who remained quiet was put to death, nor was anyone prevented from leaving the city. Even Agelaus, when he came out of his sanctuary on the following day, was not molested. The Lacedaemonians have temples dedicated not only to Fear, but to Death and Laughter and the like. They honor Fear, not as a malevolent divinity to be shunned, but because they think that the constitutions of state are mainly upheld by Fear. For this reason, Aristotle tells us that the ephors, when they enter upon their office, issue a proclamation ordering the citizens to shave the mustache and obey the laws, that the laws might not be hard upon them. The injunction about shaving the mustache is inserted, I imagine, in order to accustom the young to obedience, even in the most trivial matters. It seems to me that the ancient Spartans did not regard bravery as consisting in the absence of fear, but in the fear of shame and dread of dishonor. For those who fear laws are the bravest in battle, and those who most fear disgrace care least for their own personal safety. The poet was right who said, "Where there is fear is reverence too," and Homer makes Helen call Priam, "My father-in-law dear, whom most of all I reverence and fear," while he speaks of the Greek army as obeying its chief commands in silence and with fear. Human nature, indeed, leads most men to reverence those whom they fear, and this is why the Lacedaemonians placed the temple of Fear close to the dining hall of the Ephors, because they invested that office with almost royal authority. On the following morning, Kleomenes published a list containing the names of 80 citizens whom he required to leave the country, and remove the chairs of the Ephors, except one, which he intended to occupy himself. He now convoked an assembly, and made a speech justifying his recent acts. In the time of Lycurgus, he said, the kings and the senate shared between them the supreme authority in the state, and for a long time the government was carried on in this manner without any alteration being required, until, during the long wars with Messene, as the kings had no leisure to attend to public affairs, they chose some of their friends to sit as judges in their stead, and these persons acted at first merely as the servants of the kings, but gradually got all power into their hands, and thus insensibly established a new power in the state. A proof of the truth of this is to be found in the custom which still prevails, that when the Ephors send for the king, he refuses to attend at the first and second summons, but rises and goes to them at the third. Asteropus, who first consolidated the power of the Ephors and raised it to the highest point, flourished in comparatively recent times, many generations after the original establishment of the office. If, he went on to say, the Ephors would have behaved with moderation, it would have been better to allow them to remain in existence. But when they began to use their ill-gotten power to destroy this constitution of Sparta, when they banished one king, put another to death without trial, and kept down by terror all those who wished for the introduction of the noblest and most admirable reforms, they could no longer be borne. Had he been able, without shedding a drop of blood, to drive out of Lacedaemon all those foreign pests of luxury, extravagance, debt, money-lending, and those two more ancient evils, poverty and riches, he should have accounted himself the most fortunate of kings, because, like a skilful physician, he had painfully performed so important an operation upon his country. As it was, the use of force was sanctioned by the example of Lycurgus, who, though only a private man, appeared in arms in the marketplace, and so terrified King Charillus that he fled for refuge to the altar of Athena. He, however, being an honest and patriotic man, soon joined Lycurgus, and acquiesced in the reforms which he introduced, while the acts of Lycurgus prove that it is hard to effect a revolution without armed force, of which he declared that he had made a most sparing use, and had only put out of the way those who were opposed to the best interests of Lacedaemon. He announced to the rest of the citizens that the land should be divided among them, that they should be relieved from all their debts, and that all resident aliens should be submitted to an examination, in order that the best of them might be selected to become full citizens of Sparta, and help to defend the city from falling a prey to Aetolians and Illyrians, for want of men to defend her. After this, he himself first threw his inheritance into the common stock, and his example was followed by his father-in-law Megistonus, his friends, and the rest of the citizens. The land was now divided, and one lot was assigned to each of those whom he had banished, all of whom he said it was his intention to bring back as soon as order was restored. He recruited the numbers of the citizens by the admission of the most eligible of the Perioeci to the franchise, and organized them into a body of 4,000 heavy armed infantry, whom he taught to use the sarissa, or Macedonian pike, which was grasped with both hands, instead of the spear, and to sling their shields by a strap instead of using a handle. He next turned his attention to the education and discipline of the youth, in which he was tasked by Spherus. The gymnasia and the common meals were soon re-established, and the citizens, for the most part willingly, resumed their simple Laconian habits of living. Kleomenes, fearing to be called a despot, appointed his own brother Eucleidas as his colleague. Then, for the first time, were two kings of the same family seen at once in Sparta. As Kleomenes perceived that Aratus and the Achaeans thought that, while Sparta was passing through so perilous a crisis, her troops were not likely to leave the country, He thought that it would be both a spirited and a useful act to display the enthusiasm of his army to the enemy. He invaded the territory of Megalopolis, carried off a large booty, and laid waste a large extent of country. Finding a company of players on their road from Messene, he took them prisoners, caused a theatre to be erected in the enemy's country, and offered them 40 minae for a performance for one day, at which he himself attended as a spectator. Not that he cared for the performance, but because he wished to mock at his enemies, and to show by this studied insult the enormous superiority of which he was conscious. At this period his was the only army, Greek or foreign, which was not attended by actors, jugglers, dancing girls, and singers, but he kept it free from all licentiousness and buffoonery, as the younger men were nearly always being practised in martial exercises, while the elders acted as their instructors, and when they were at great leisure, they assumed themselves with witty retorts and sententious Laconian pleasantries. The great value of this kind of discipline is described at greater lengths in the life of Lycurgus. In everything Kleomenes himself acted as their teacher and example, offering his own simple, frugal life, so entirely free from vulgar superfluities, as a model of sobriety for them all to copy, and this added greatly to his influence in Greece. For when men attended the courts of the other kings of that period, they were not so much impressed by their wealth and lavish expenditure as they were disgusted by their arrogant, overbearing manners. But when they met Kleomenes, who was every inch a king, and saw that he wore no purple robes, did not lounge on couches and litters, and was not surrounded by a crowd of messengers, doorkeepers, and secretaries, so as to be difficult of access, but that he himself, dressed in plain clothes, came and shook them by the hand, and conversed with them in a kindly and encouraging tone, they were completely fascinated and charmed by him, and declared that he alone was a true descendant of Heracles. His dinner was usually served upon a very small Laconian table with 3 couches, but if he were entertaining ambassadors or foreigners, 2 additional couches were added, and his servants somewhat improved his dinner, not by adding to it made dishes and pastry, but by serving a greater abundance of food and a more liberal allowance of wine. Indeed, he blamed one of his friends when he heard that, when entertaining foreigners at dinners, he had placed before them black broth and barley cakes. For he said that, in such matters, and when entertaining strangers, it was not well to be too rigidly Spartan. After the table was removed, a tripod was brought in which supported a bronze bowl full of wine, 2 silver paterae that held each about a pint, and a number of very small silver cups, from which any one drank who wished, for Kleomenes never forced a man to drink against his will. No recitations were performed for the amusement of the guests, for he himself would lead the conversation and entertain them over their wine, partly by asking questions of them, and partly by relating anecdotes to them, for he well knew both how to make serious subjects interesting, and to be pleasant and witty without giving offence. He was of opinion that the habit of other princes, of tempting men into their service by presents and bribes, was both clumsy and wicked, but he thought it peculiarly befitting a king to influence and captivate men's minds by the charm of his conversation, and was wont to say that a friend differed only from a mercenary soldier, and that a man wins the one by the influence of his character and his conversation, and the other by his money. First of all, the people of Mantinea made overtures to him. They admitted him to their city by night, aided him to drive out the Achaean garrison, and placed themselves unreservedly in his hands. He, however, restored them to the enjoyment of their own laws and original constitution, and marched away the same day to Tegea. Shortly afterwards, by a circuitous march through Arcadia, he arrived before the Achaean city of Pherae, desiring either to fight a battle with the Achaeans, or to make Aratus incur the disgrace of retreating and leaving him in possession of the country. For although Hyperbates was nominally in command, all real power over the Achaeans was in the hands of Aratus. The Achaeans took the field with their entire force and encamped at Dymae, near the temple called Hecatombeion. When Cleomenes arrived here, he was unwilling to establish himself between the hostile city of Dymae and the army of the Achaeans, and challenged them, forced them to fight, and completely routed their phalanx. He killed many, took a large number of prisoners, and then, marching to Langon, drove out the Achaean garrison and restored the city to the Eleans. As the Achaean power was now quite broken, Aratus, who was usually elected general every other year, refused to take office, and excused himself when they besought him to do so. A dishonorable act, when the times became more stormy, to desert the helm, and give up his power to another. Cleomenes at first used very moderate language to the Achaean ambassadors, but sent others ordering them to acknowledge him for their sovereign, and promising that if they did so, he would do them no further harm, and would at once restore the prisoners and fortresses which he had taken. As the Achaeans were willing to accept these terms, they invited Cleomenes to a conference at Lerna. It happened, however, that Kleomenes, after a long march, drank a quantity of cold water, which caused him to bring up much blood and to lose his voice. In consequence of this, although he sent back the most distinguished of his prisoners, he was obliged to postpone the conference, and went home to Lacedaemon. This mischance ruined Greece, which even now might have recovered herself, and avoided falling into the hands of the insolent and rapacious Macedonians. For Aratus, either because he distrusted and feared Cleomenes, or else because he grudged him his success, and thought that after he had for 33 years been chief of the Achaeans, it was not to be endured that a young man should overthrow him, and enter into the fruit of his labors, at first tried to oppose the Achaeans when they came to offer to terms with the Lacedaemonians. But as they would not listen to him, because they were cowed by the boldness of Cleomenes, and also admitted the justice of the Lacedaemonian claim to be the leading state in Peloponnesus, as their ancestral right, he adopted a course which was a disgraceful one for any Greek, but especially so for him, and one which was most unworthy of his former political life. He determined to invite Antigonus into Greece, and to fill the Peloponnesus with those very Macedonians whom he himself when a lad had chased out of the country by his capture of the Acrocorinthus, although he was regarded with suspicion by all the kings, and was at variance with them all, and though he had already excused this very Antigonus himself of every conceivable crime in his memoirs, which are still extant. Yet he himself has stated that he suffered much, and risked much to free Athens from a Macedonian garrison, though now he led these very men with arms in their hands into his own native country, and up to his own paternal hearth. He thought that Cleomenes, a descendant of Heracles, a king of Sparta, who had restored the simple, ancient Dorian constitution of Lycurgus, as one tightens the relaxed strings of a lyre to bring it into tune, was unworthy to be accounted the ruler of Sicyon and Tritia, and in his eagerness to avoid the rough Spartan cloak and the Spartan barley bread, and that which he especially charged Cleomenes, the destruction of wealth and the encouragement of poverty, threw himself, and all Achaea with him, into the arms of the Macedonians, with all their diadems and their purple robes, and their habits of oriental despotism. That he might avoid acting under the orders of Cleomenes, he was content to offer sacrifice at festivals in honor of Antigonus, and himself to place a garland upon his head, and to lead the paean in praise of a man wasted and emaciated by consumption. And this I write, not from any desire to depreciate Aratus, for in many respects he proved himself a great and patriotic man, but rather out of pity for the weakness of human nature, which will not allow even the most eminent persons to present us with the spectacle of an entirely unblemished virtue. When the Achaeans again assembled at Argos to hold a conference there, and Cleomenes started to go thither from Tegea, men's minds were full of hope that peace would be finally established. But Aratus, who had already settled the main points of his treaty with Antigonus, and declared that Kleomenes would either by persuasion or force bring the assembly over to his views, sent to him, demanding either that he should take 300 hostages for his safety and come to the conference alone, or else meet them with his army outside the walls of the gymnasium called the Calarabium. Kleomenes, on hearing this, said that he had not been properly treated, for Aratus ought to have warned him of this at once, not have waited till he was almost at the gates of Argos, and then expressed suspicions of his honesty of purpose and driven him away. He sent a letter to the assembled Achaeans, containing bitter invectives against Aratus, and as Aratus replied by maligning him in a public oration, he broke up his camp, and sent a herald with a declaration of war, not to Argos according to Aratus, but to Actium, in order to take the Achaeans by surprise. The Achaean cities were all ripe for revolt, as the populace hoped for a redistribution of the land, and cancelling of debts if they joined the Spartans, while the leading men were all jealous of the power and influence of Aratus, and some of them hated him as the traitor who was bringing the Macedonians into Peloponnesus. Relying upon the prevalence of this feeling, Kleomenes invaded Achaea, took Pellene by surprise, and drove out the garrison and the Achaean inhabitants. Soon afterward, he captured the cities of Phineus and Pentelium. The Achaeans of Corinth and Sicyon now began to fear that his partisans were plotting to deliver up those cities to him, and in consequence sent their cavalry and foreign mercenaries away from Argos to guard those towns, while they themselves proceeded to Argos to hold the Nemean festival there. Kleomenes, rightly judging that his appearance at a time when the city was full of a disorderly crowd of people who were come to attend the feasts and games would produce great confusion, marched up to the walls by night, seized the place called the Shield, which is just above the theatre, and is very difficult of access, and so terrified the citizens that no one attempted to offer any resistance. They willingly agreed to admit a Spartan garrison to give 20 of their chief men as hostages for their loyalty, and to become the allies of the Lacedaemonians, acknowledging their supremacy. This exploit added not a little to the reputation and power of Kleomenes. None of the ancient kings of Sparta could ever make themselves masters of Argos, although they often attempted to do so, and even that most brilliant general, King Pyrrhus, though he forced his way into the city, could not take it, but perished, and with him a great part of his army. For these reasons the skill and audacity of Kleomenes were the more admired, and those who had before ridiculed his attempts to bring back the days of Solon and Lycurgus by the cancelling of debts and redistribution of land, now became entirely convinced that these measures had been the cause of the revival of Sparta. The Spartans before this had been so feeble and helpless that the Aetolians invaded Laconia and carried off a booty of 50,000 slaves, on which occasion it is said that an old Spartan observed that the enemy had greatly benefited Laconia by relieving it from its burdens. Yet a short time after this, by the restoration of their former constitution, and by re-establishing the ancient system of training, they made as magnificent a display of discipline and valor as if Lycurgus himself were alive and at the head of the fairs, for they gained for Sparta the first place in Greece, and won the whole of Peloponnesus by the sword. The submission of Argos to Kleomenes was soon followed by that of Phlius and Cleone. During these events, Aratus was at Corinth, busily engaged in searching for the partisans of the Lacedaemonians. When the news of the fall of these cities reached Corinth, as he observed that the city of Corinth was eager to join Kleomenes and leave the Achaean League, he summoned the citizens to meet in the public assembly, and himself made his way unperceived to the gate. He had already sent his horse thither, and mounting, fled to Sicyon. The Corinthians now hurried to Argos to surrender their city to Kleomenes. In such haste, writes Aratus in his memoirs, that they foundered all their horses. Kleomenes reproached them for allowing Aratus to escape, but shortly afterwards sent Megisthenes to him, asking him to hand over the citadel of Corinth, which was in possession of an Achaean garrison, and offered him a large sum of money. He answered that the course of affairs was not in his power, but that he was rather in theirs. These particulars we have extracted from Aratus's own writings. Kleomenes now marched from Argos to Corinth, receiving on the way the submission of Troezen, Epidaurus, and Termini. As the garrison refused to surrender the citadel, he built a rampart around it, and, sending for the friends and representatives of Aratus, bade them take charge of his house and property during his absence. He now sent the Messenian Tritomalus to Aratus, with instructions to propose to him that the garrison of Acrocorinthus should be composed partly of Spartan and partly of Achaean troops, while he himself privately offered him double the amount of the pension which he received from King Ptolemy of Egypt. However, as Aratus refused to listen to his overtures, but sent his own son with the other hostages to Antigonus, and persuaded the Achaeans to pass a decree to hand over the Acrocorinthus to Antigonus, Kleomenes invaded the territory of Sicyon and laid it waste, and also took the property of Aratus when it was publicly presented to him by the people of Corinth. When Antigonus crossed the Geranian mountains with a large force, Kleomenes did not think it necessary to guard the isthmus, but determined to fortify the mountains called Onia, and by holding that strong position to protract the war and wear out the Macedonian force, rather than fight a pitched battle with their phalanx. By this line of policy he reduced Antigonus to great straits, for he had made no preparation for feeding his troops for more than a short time, and yet to force his way in over the isthmus was a difficult operation, while Kleomenes barred the way. An attempt which he made to steal through by Lachaeum at night was repulsed with considerable loss, so that Kleomenes and his friends, elated by their victory, supped merrily together, while Antigonus was at his wits' end to know what to do. He even began to meditate marching to the promontory of Hyraium, and conveying his forces over the Corinthian Gulf to Sicyon, an operation which would have required much time and many ships. However, late in the evening there arrived certain friends of Aratus by sea from Argos, inviting him to come thither, as the Argives intended to revolt upon Kleomenes. The prime mover in this revolt was one Aristoteles, who easily prevailed upon the people to rise, because they were disappointed with Kleomenes, who had not cancelled all their debts as they hoped he would. Aratus now took 1,500 of Antigonus's soldiers and proceeded by sea to Epidaurus. Aristoteles, however, did not wait for his arrival, but led the citizens to attack the garrison in the citadel, assisted by Timoxenus with a body of Achaeans from Sicyon. Intelligence of this movement reached Kleomenes about the second watch of the night. He at once sent for Megistonus, and angrily ordered him at once to go to the assistance of the garrison of Argos, for it was he who had so confidently assured Kleomenes of the loyalty of the Argives, and had dissuaded him from banishing those whom he suspected from the city. Having detached Megistonus with 2,000 men on his service, he himself turned his attention to Antigonus, and pacified the people of Corinth by assuring them that nothing had happened at Argos except a slight disturbance which would be easily suppressed. However, as Megistonus was killed while forcing his way into the city, and the garrison were hard pressed, and kept sending messengers to Kleomenes begging for assistance, he, fearing that if the enemy gained Argos they might cut him off from Laconia and sack the defenseless city of Sparta, withdrew his army from Corinth. He lost this city at once, for Antigonus instantly entered it and placed a garrison in it. He now proceeded to assault the city wall of Argos and concentrated his troops for this purpose. He broke through the vault supporting the part of the city called the Shield, forced his way in, and joined his garrison, who were all still holding out against the Achaeans. By the use of scaling ladders, captured some of the strong places in the city, and cleared the streets of the enemy by means of his Cretan archers. When, however, he saw Antigonus marching down from the mountains to the plain with his phalanx in battle array, and saw the Macedonian cavalry pouring along towards the city, he despaired of success, and, collecting all his troops into one mass, led them safely out of the city. He had, in a wonderfully short time, effected great things, and had all but made himself master of the whole of Peloponnesus. But now he lost it all as quickly as he had won it, and for some of his allies at once deserted him, and many shortly afterwards surrendered their city to Antigonus. As Kleomenes was marching into the city of Tegea at nightfall, on his return from this disastrous campaign, he was met by messengers bearing the news of a still greater calamity, the death of his wife Agis, of whom he was so fond that even when in the full tide of success, he never would remain continuously with his army, but used constantly to return to Sparta to see her. He was terribly grieved and cast down, as one would expect a young man to be on losing so beautiful and excellent a wife. Yet he did not allow his noble spirit to be crushed by his sorrow, but, without showing any outward signs of grief in his voice or countenance, continued to give his orders to his officers, and to take measures for placing Tegea in a posture of defense. At daybreak next morning he returned to Lacedaemon, and after lamenting his misfortune with his mother and children, began to consider by what policy he might save his country. Ptolemy, the king of Egypt, now offered him assistance on the condition of receiving his mother and children as hostages. For a long time he shrank from mentioning this proposal to his mother, and often conversed with her without having the courage to allude to it, until she suspected that he had something on his mind, and inquired of his friends whether there was not some subject about which he hesitated to speak to her. At last Cleomenes brought himself to mention Ptolemy's proposal to her. On hearing it, she laughed loudly, and said, "This, then, is that which you have so long been fearing to tell me? Pray, place me and the children on board ship as soon as possible, and send us to any place where this body of mine may be useful to Sparta, before it be uselessly consumed by old age at home." When all was prepared for her voyage, Cratysiclia proceeded to Taenarus, escorted by Cleomenes with all his troops under arms. Before embarking, she retired alone with him into the temple of Poseidon, where, after embracing him as he sorrowed at her departure, she said, "Now, king of the Lacedaemonians, take care when we come out that no one sees us weeping or doing anything unworthy of Sparta. This lies in our own power, but good or evil fortune befalls us according to the will of heaven." Saying thus, she fixed her eyes upon the ship, walked swiftly to it carrying the shield, and bade the pilot start at once. When she reached Egypt, as she heard that Ptolemy had received an embassy from Antigonus, and was told that although the Achaeans wished to come to terms with him, he had feared on her account to make peace with them without consulting Ptolemy, she wrote to him bidding him act worthily of Sparta, and consult her interests, and not to fear to displease Ptolemy because of what he might do to an old woman and an infant. So great a spirit is she said to have shown in her misfortunes. Antigonus now advanced, took Tegea, and allowed his troops to plunder Orchomenus and Mantinea. Cleomenes, who was confined to the territory of Lacedaemon, proceeded to emancipate all Helots who could pay a sum of 5 Attic minae for their freedom, by which means he raised a sum of 500 talents. He also organized a special corps of 2,000 men, armed after the Macedonian fashion, with which he hoped to be able to meet the Leucaspids, or white-shielded troops of Antigonus, and proceeded to attempt a wonderful and surprising feat of arms. The city of Megalopolis at that time was itself quite as large and as powerful as Sparta, and had close at hand the army of the Achaeans, and that of Antigonus himself, whom the people of Megalopolis had been especially eager to invite into Peloponnesus. This city Cleomenes determined to pounce upon. No other word expresses the speed with which he surprised it. He ordered his troops to provision themselves for 5 days, and led them to Cilicia, as though he intended to invade Argolis. From Cilicia he marched into the territory of Megalopolis, halted at Retium for supper, and thence proceeded along the road by Helicus straight toward Megalopolis. When he was close to it, he detached Pantius with 2 regiments to attack a part of the wall lying between 2 towers, which he had heard was often left unguarded, while he moved slowly forward with the main body. Pantius not only found that spot, but a great extent of the city wall unguarded. While he was engaged in throwing down the wall and killing those who attempted to defend it, Kleomenes came up and was within the city with his army before the people of Megalopolis knew of his arrival. When at last the inhabitants discovered the extent of their misfortune, some snatched up what they could and fled at once, while others got under arms and endeavored to drive out the enemy. In this they could not succeed, but they enabled the fugitives to escape unmolested, so that no more than 1,000 souls remained in the city, as all the rest got safe with their wives and children to Messene. Of those who offered resistance, but a few were slain, and a very small number were taken prisoners, amongst whom were Lysandridas and Theocritus, the two most important persons in Megalopolis. On this account, the soldiers who took them brought them at once to Kleomenes. Lysandridas, as soon as he saw Kleomenes at a distance, called out loudly to him, "King of the Lacedaemonians, now you have an opportunity to add to your glory by a deed even more noble and more worthy of a king than that which you have achieved." Kleomenes, suspecting what he meant, asked, "What do you mean, Lysandridas? Do you bid me give you back your city?" "That is what I bid you do," answered Lysandridas, "and I advise you not to ruin so great a city, but to fill it with friends and trusty allies, by restoring it to the people of Megalopolis, and becoming their savior." To this, Kleomenes, after a short silence, replied, "It is hard to believe this, but let us ever prefer honor to profit." Saying this, he sent his prisoners to Messene, and a herald with them, who offered to restore the city to the people of Megalopolis, on the condition that they should desert the Achaeans, and become the friends and allies of the Spartans. However, Philopaemen would not allow his countrymen to break their faith with the Achaeans, and accept this wise and generous offer. He declared that Kleomenes did not intend to give them back their city, but wanted to get possession of them as well as of their city, and with violent abuse drove Theocritus and Lysandridas back out to the Messenian country. This was that Philopaemen who afterwards became the general of the Achaeans, and won great distinction, as will be found in the life of him which I have written. When this answer was brought back to Kleomenes, who had hitherto carefully kept the city unharmed, and had not allowed any one to appropriate the most trifling article, he became furious with disappointment. He plundered the city, sent all the statues and pictures to Sparta, utterly destroyed all the best part of the city, and returned home, for he feared Antigonus and the Achaeans. They, however, did not offer to attack him, for they were engaged in holding a conference at Aegium. Here Aratus ascended the tribune, and for a long time wept with his face hidden in his gown. At last, as the others in wonder bade him tell them the cause of his grief, he said that Megalopolis had been ruined by Kleomenes. On hearing this, the assembly at once broke up. The Achaeans were terror-stricken at the suddenness and importance of the blow, and Antigonus determined to proceed to the assistance of the people of Megalopolis. But as it took a long time to assemble his troops from their winter quarters, he ordered them to stay where they were, and himself with a small force marched to Argos. Kleomenes, now engaged in a second enterprise, which appeared completely insane, but which is said by the historian Polybius to show consummate generalship. As he knew that all the Macedonian troops were scattered over the country in winter quarters, and that Antigonus, with a few mercenary troops, was spending the winter at Argos with his friends, he invaded the Argive territory, thinking that either he should shame Antigonus into a battle and beat him, or else that if he did not dare to fight, the Argives would be disgusted with him. And so it fell out. The Argives, seeing their country spoiled by Kleomenes, were greatly enraged, and gathered together before the house in which Antigonus was lodging, excitedly calling upon him either to fight or to resign his post as commander-in-chief in favor of a better man. But Antigonus, like a prudent general as he was, thought it more disgraceful to run foolish risks and incur unnecessary danger than to hear himself called hard names by the mob, and refused to leave the city, but stood constant in his original policy. Kleomenes, after marching up to the gates of Argos, ostentatiously ravaged the country, and returned home unmolested. Shortly afterwards, hearing that Antigonus had again advanced to Tegea, intending to invade Laconia by that route. Cleomenes quickly assembled his army, marched by a different road, avoiding Antigonus, and at daybreak appeared near the city of Argos, where he ravaged the plain country, not reaping the corn, as invaders usually do, with sickles and swords, but beating down with great clubs, so that his soldiers, in sheer sport as they marched along, were able to destroy the whole crop without trouble. When they reached the gymnasium of Kilaribus, some of the officers proposed to set it on fire, but Cleomenes forbade it, saying that even in destroying Megalopolis he had been guided by anger rather than by honor. Antigonus at first retired directly towards Argos, but afterwards occupied all the passages which the Lacedaemonians could retreat. Cleomenes affected to set him at defiance, and sent a herald to Argos to demand the keys of the temple of Hera, between Argos and Mycenae, in order that he might offer sacrifices there before retiring. After insulting the Argives by this ironical request, he offered sacrifice outside the temple, for the doors remained locked, and led away his army to Phlius. From thence he marched to Mount Alagurtus, where he defeated the Macedonian troops who guarded the pass, and returned home by way of Orchomenus, having inspired his countrymen with hope and confidence, and having proved to his enemies that he was a consummate general, capable of conducting the most important operations. It was indeed no small feat for him, with only the resources of one small state at his disposal, to make war against the power of Macedonia and all the cities of the Peloponnesus, with Antigonus for their paymaster, and not only to prevent the enemy setting foot in Laconia, but to lay waste their country, and take such large and important cities from them. However, he who first called money the sinews of war must have had this war in mind. So also Demades, when the Athenians wished to man a fleet at a time when they had no money, observed that they must make bread before they could make a voyage. Archidamus, too, who was king of Sparta at the opening of the Peloponnesian War, when his allies asked him to fix the limit of their several contributions, answered that the consumption of war is unlimited. For just as trained athletes in time overpower their antagonist in spite of his strength and skill, so Antigonus, having vast resources to draw upon, wearied out and overpowered Cleomenes, who had the greatest difficulty in paying his mercenary troops and feeding his countrymen. In other respects, the long duration of the contest was in Cleomenes' favor, as Antigonus had troubles at home, which made the contest a more equal one. The barbarians, in his absence, always overran and plundered the outskirts of the kingdom of Macedonia, and at this period an army of Illyrians had invaded the country from the north, against whose depredations the Macedonians besought Antigonus to return and protect them. The letter calling upon him to return was very nearly delivered to him before the decisive battle of the war, and had he received it, he would no doubt have returned home at once and taken a long farewell of the Achaeans. However, Fortune, who delights to show that the most important events are decided by the merest trifles, caused the embassy with the letters for the recall of Antigonus to reach him just after the battle of Cilicia, in which Cleomenes lost his army and his country. This makes the misfortune of Cleomenes yet more pitiable, for if he had avoided a battle for 2 days longer, he never need have fought it at all, as the Macedonians would have retreated, and left him to make what terms he pleased with the Achaeans, whereas, as has been explained, his want of money forced him to fight, and that too when, according to Polybius, he had only 20,000 men to oppose 30,000. In the battle he acted like a great general, and the Spartans fought with desperate courage, while the mercenary troops also behaved well, but he was overpowered by the Macedonian armament and by the irresistible weight of their phalanx. The historian Philarchus says that Cleomenes was ruined by treachery, for Antigonus sent his Illyrians and Acarnanians to make a flank march and attack one of the enemy's wings, which was commanded by Euclides, the brother of Cleomenes, and there placed the rest of his army in battle array. Cleomenes, who was watching the enemy from an eminence, could not see the Illyrian and Acarnanian troops, and suspected some maneuver of the kind. He sent for Damateles, the chief of the Spartan secret service, and ordered him to explore the ground on both flanks, and see that no attack was meditated in that direction. As Demoteles, who is said to have been bribed by Antigonus, answered that all was well on the flanks, and that he had better give his entire attention to the enemy in front, Kleomenes believed him, and at once charged the army of Antigonus. The furious attack of the Spartans drove back the Macedonian phalanx, and Kleomenes forced it to retreat before him for a distance of about 5 stadia. Then as he found that his brother Euclides on the other wing was surrounded by the enemy, he halted, and looking towards him said, "You are gone, my dearest brother. You have fought bravely, and are a noble model to the Spartan youth, a noble theme for Spartan maiden songs." Then as the entire division under Euclides was cut to pieces, and the victors attacked his own men, who were thrown into confusion and could no longer stand their ground, he escaped from the field as best he could. It is said that many of the mercenaries were slain, and that of the Lacedaemonians, who were 6,000 in all, only 200 remained alive. Kleomenes, when he reached Sparta, advised the citizens whom he met to submit to Antigonus, and declared that he himself, whether he lived or died, would do what was best for Sparta. As he saw the women running up to those who had accompanied him in his fight, taking their arms from them and offering them drink, he retired into his own house, where his mistress, a girl of a good family of Megalopolis, whom he had taken to live with him after his wife's death, came up to him as usual and wished to attend upon him on his return from the wars. But he would neither drink, although excessively thirsty, nor sit down, weary though he was, but in his armor, as he was, took hold of one of the columns with his hand, leaned his face upon his elbow, and after resting a short time in this posture, while he revolved in his mind every kind of plan, proceeded with his friends to Grythium. Here they embarked on a ship which had been prepared in case of such a disaster, and sailed away. After the battle, Antigonus advanced upon Sparta, and made himself master of the city. He treated the Lacedaemonians with kindness, and offered no kind of insult to their glorious city, but permitted them to retain their laws and constitution, sacrificed to the gods, and on the 3rd day withdrew, as he had learned that a terrible war was raging in Macedonia, and that his kingdom was being ravaged by the barbarians. His health was already affected by a disease, which ended in consumption. However, he bore up against it, and was able to die gloriously after having recovered his kingdom, won a great victory over the barbarians, and killed a great number of them. Philarchus tells us that he ruptured his lungs by shouting in the battle itself, and this seems the most probable account, but the common report at the time was that while shouting aloud after the victory, "Oh, happy day!" he brought up a vast quantity of blood, and fell sick of a fever, of which he died. Such was the fate of Antigonus. Kleomenes sailed from Cythera to another island, Agialea. As he was about to cross over from this place to Cyrene, one of his friends, named Therichion, a brilliant warrior and a man of lofty, unbending spirit, said to him in private, "My king, we have lost the opportunity of falling by the noblest of deaths in the battle, although we publicly declared that Antigonus should never enter Sparta unless he first passed over the dead body of the king. However, the course which is next to this in honor is still open to us. Why should we recklessly embark on this voyage, merely in order to exchange our misfortunes at home for others in a distant country? If it be not disgraceful for the sons of Heracles to submit to the successors of Philip and Alexander, we shall save ourselves a long voyage by delivering ourselves up to Antigonus, who is probably as much better than Ptolemy as the Macedonians are better than the Egyptians. If, on the other hand, we scorn to become the subjects of our conqueror, why should we become subject to one who has not conquered us, and so prove ourselves inferior to 2 men instead of 1, by becoming the courtiers of Ptolemy as well as fleeing before Antigonus? Is it on account of your mother that we are going to Egypt? If so, you will indeed make a glorious appearance before her, and you will be much to be envied when she shows her son to the ladies of Ptolemy's court, an exile instead of a king. While we are still masters of our own swords, and are still in sight of Laconia, let us put ourselves beyond the reaches of further misfortunes, and make amends to those who died for Sparta at Cilicia, rather than settle ourselves in Egypt, and acquire whom Antigonus has been pleased to appoint satrap of Lacedaemon." To these remarks of Therichion, Kleomenes answered, "Wretch! Do you think that by suicide, the easiest way out of all difficulties, and one which is within every man's reach, you will gain a reputation for bravery, and will not rather be flying before the enemy more disgracefully than at Silesia? More powerful men than ourselves have ere now been defeated, either by their own evil fortune or by the excessive numbers of their enemy. But the man who refuses to bear fatigue and misery and the scorn of men is conquered by his own cowardice. A self-inflicted death ought to be an honorable action, not a dishonorable means of escape from the necessity for action. It is disgraceful either to live or to die for oneself alone. Yet this is the course which you recommend, namely, that I should fly from my present misery without ever performing any useful or honorable action. I think it is both your duty and mine not to despair of our country, for when all hope fails us, we can easily find means to die. To this Thoricion made no answer, but as soon as he had an opportunity, left Kleomenes, sought a retired spot upon the beach, and killed himself. Kleomenes sailed from Aegaleia to Libya, where he was received with royal honors and conducted to Alexandria. At his first interview, Ptolemy treated him with mere ordinary politeness, but when by conversation with him he discovered his great abilities, and in the familiar intercourse of daily life observed the noble Spartan simplicity of his habits, and saw with how proud and unbroken a spirit he bore his misfortunes, he thought him a much more trustworthy friend than any of the venal throng of courtiers by whom he was surrounded. Ptolemy felt real regret at having neglected so great a man, and allowed Antigonus to gain so much glory and power at his expense. He showed Kleomenes great kindness and honor, and encouraged him by promising that he would place a fleet and a sum of money at his disposal, which would enable him to return to Greece and recover his throne. He settled upon him a yearly allowance of 24 talents, the most part of which he and his friends, who still retained their simple Spartan habits, distributed in charity among the Greek refugees who had found an asylum in Egypt. The elder Ptolemy died before he could accomplish his promise of attempting to restore Kleomenes to his throne, and amidst the drunken license of the court of his successor, the affairs of Kleomenes were entirely neglected. The young king was so given up to wine and women that his soberest moments were spent in organizing religious ceremonies in the palace, and in carrying a kettle drum in honor of the Mother of the Gods. The whole of the public business of the kingdom was managed by Agathoclea, the king's mistress, her mother, and the brothel keeper, Oenanthes. Yet even here it seems that the assistance of Kleomenes was needed, for the king, fearing his brother Agis, who through his mother had great influence with the army, attached himself in a special manner to Kleomenes, and made him a member of his own secret council, desiring to make use of him to kill his brother. Kleomenes, although every one in the court bade him do this, refused, saying that it would rather be his duty, if it were possible, to raise up more brothers for the king, to strengthen and confirm his throne. When Sosibius, the most powerful of the king's favorites, said that the mercenary troops were not to be depended upon while Magus was alive, Kleomenes answered that he might be quite easy on that score, for more than 3,000 of the mercenaries were Peloponnesians, and that the slightest sign from him would seize their arms and rally round him. This speech was thought at the time to be a great proof of the loyalty of Kleomenes, and gave the courtiers a great idea of his power, but afterwards, as Ptolemy's weakness of character produced cowardice, and after the manner of empty-headed men he began to think it safest to suspect everyone, these words made the courtiers fear Kleomenes as having a dangerous power over the mercenaries, and many of them were wont to say, "This man moves among us like a lion among a flock of sheep." Indeed, the manner of Kleomenes in the Egyptian palace, as he calmly and quietly watched the course of events, naturally suggested this simile. Kleomenes gave up asking for a fleet and an army, but hearing that Antigonus was dead, and that the Achaeans were involved in a war with the Aetolians, while his presence was imperatively demanded at home, as all Peloponnesus seemed to be going to ruin, he desired to be sent home alone with his friends. However, he could persuade no one to accede to this request, as the king thought of nothing but his concubines and his revels, and Sosibius, upon whom devolved the whole conduct of affairs, although he knew that Kleomenes would be dangerous and hard to manage if kept in Egypt against his will, yet feared to set at large so daring and enterprising a man, who had gained a thorough insight into the utter rottenness of the Ptolemaic dynasty. For Kleomenes could not be bribed into remaining quiet, but as the bull sacred to Apis, although he is abundantly fed and supplied with every luxury, yet longs to frisk and range about as nature intended, so he cared for none of their effeminate pleasures, but wore his soul away like Achilles, idling at home, though eager for the fray. While his affairs were in this posture, there arrived at Alexandria one Nicagoras, a Messenian, who pretended to be a friend to Kleomenes, but really hated him bitterly, because he had once sold him a fair estate, but had never received the money, either because Kleomenes intended to cheat him, or because he was unable to pay him on account of the wars. As this man was disembarking from his ship, Kleomenes, who happened to be walking upon the quay, saw him, and at once warmly greeted him, and inquired what business had brought him to Egypt. Nicagoras returned his salute with equal friendliness, and said that he had brought over some fine horses for the king's use in the wars. At this Kleomenes laughed and said, I had rather you had brought singing girls or beautiful boys, for they are what to please the king best. Nicagoras listened to this remark with a smile, but a few days afterwards he reminded Kleomenes of the estate which he had bought, and asked him to pay the price, saying that he would not have pressed for it if he had not sustained losses on his cargo. As Kleomenes replied that all his pension from the king was spent, Nicagoras in a rage repeated to Sosibius the sarcasm which he had used. Sosibius was much pleased to hear it, but as he wished to have some graver matter of which to accuse him to the king, he persuaded Nicagoras to write a letter before he left Egypt, accusing Kleomenes of a design to make himself master of Cyrene, if the king put him in possession of a fleet and army. Nicagoras wrote the letter and sailed away to Greece, and after 40 days Sosibius took the letter and showed it to Ptolemy, as though he had just received it. By this means he so wrought upon the young king's mind that he confined Kleomenes in a large house, and placed a guard before all the doors, although he continued to allow him his pension as before. This treatment was in itself sufficiently grievous to Kleomenes, and made him fear that something worse was in store. Now Ptolemy, the son of Chrysermes, who was a friend of the king's, had always been on good terms with Kleomenes, and they had been in the habit of conversing familiarly together. This man now, at Kleomenes' own request, came to see him, and talked amicably with him, explaining away all which had appeared suspicious about the king's conduct. As he was leaving the house, without noticing that Kleomenes had followed him to the door, he harshly reproved the guard for keeping such careless watch over so great and savage a monster. Kleomenes himself heard him say this, and before Ptolemy observed him, retired, and told his friends what he had heard. They at once abandoned all hope, and fiercely determined to avenge themselves on Ptolemy for his wickedness and arrogance, and die as became Spartans, not wait to be butchered like fat cattle. They thought that it was intolerable that Kleomenes should have disdained to make terms with Antigonus, who was a soldier and a man of action, and should sit waiting for the pleasure of a timbrel-playing king, who, as soon as he was at leisure from his kettle-drummings and revellings, intended to murder him. As soon as they had formed this resolution, as it happened that Ptolemy had gone to Canopus, they spread a report that the king had given orders for the guard to be removed. Next, observing the custom of the kings of Egypt, which was to send a dinner and various presents to those who were about to be released from confinement, the friends of Kleomenes prepared many presents of this kind and sent them to him, deceiving the guard, who believed that they had been sent by the king. Kleomenes offered sacrifice, and gave the soldiers on guard an ample share of the meat, while he himself put on a garland and feasted with his friends. It is said that they proceeded to action sooner than they had originally been intended, because Kleomenes perceived that one of the servants who was in the plot had left the house, though he had only gone to visit his mistress. Fearing that he meant to denounce them, as soon as it was noon and the guard were sleeping off their wine, Kleomenes put on his tunic, slit up the seam over the right shoulder, seized his naked sword, and sallied forth with his friends, similarly arrayed, 13 in all. One of them, named Hippias, who was lame, came boldly out with the rest, but finding that they proceeded slowly to enable him to keep up with them, begged them to kill him, and not spoil their plot by waiting for a useless man. It happened that one of the Alexandrians was leading a horse past the door. They at once took it, placed Hepatus on its back, and ran quickly through the streets, calling upon the populace to rise and set itself free. The people, it appears, had spirit enough to admire Kleomenes, but no one dared to follow or help him. 3 of the conspirators met Ptolemy, the son of Chrysermes, coming out of the palace, and killed him. And when another Ptolemy, the governor of the city, drove towards them in a chariot, they rushed to meet him, scattered his bodyguard, dragged him out of the chariot, and killed him. They now made their way to the citadel, intending to break open the prison and make use of the prisoners to swell their numbers. But the guardians of the prison had closed the gates effectually before they arrived, and Kleomenes, failing in this attempt, roamed through the streets without finding anyone to join him, as all fled in terror at his approach. At last he stopped and said to his friends, "No wonder women bear rule in a city where men fear to be free." He now bade them all end their lives worthily of him and of themselves. First of all, Hippias, at his own request, was struck dead by one of the younger men. After which, each man deliberately and fearlessly inflicted upon himself a mortal stab, with the exception of Pantius, who had been the first to break into the city of Megalopolis. This man, the handsomest and best warrior of all the Spartan youth, was especially loved by the king, and was ordered by him to wait till all the rest were dead, and then to put an end to his life. When they had all fallen, Pantius pricked each man with his dagger, to make certain that none of them were alive. When he pricked Kleomenes in the ankle, he saw his face contract. He kissed him, and sat down beside him until he was quite dead, and then, embracing the corpse, killed himself over it. Thus perished Kleomenes, after having reigned over Sparta for 13 years, as described above. The news of his death was soon bruited abroad, and Cratysiclia, although a woman of high spirit, was so overcome by her misfortune that she embraced the children and wept for Kleomenes. Upon this, the eldest boy leaped up, and before anyone knew what he was doing, threw himself headlong from the roof of the house. He was much hurt, but not killed, and was taken up, crying and reproaching his friends because they would not allow him to die. When Ptolemy heard the news, he ordered the corpse of Kleomenes to be flayed and exposed on a gibbet, and his children, his mother, and her attendants to be put to death. Among these was the wife of Pantius, the fairest and noblest looking of them all. She and her husband had only recently been married when their misfortunes began. When Pantius left Sparta, she wished to accompany him, but her parents would not allow her to do so, and locked her up in their house. But she shortly afterwards procured a horse and a little money, and made her escape by night. She rode all the way to Taenarium, where she found a ship about to sail to Egypt, on board of which she crossed the sea, joined her husband, and cheerfully shared his exile. She now, when the soldiers came to lead away Cratysiclia, took her by the hand, held up the train of her dress, and bade her be of good courage. Although Cratysiclia herself was not afraid to die, but only asked one favor, that she might die before her children. When they arrived at the place of execution, the children were first killed before the eyes of Cratysiclia, and then she herself. All she said was, "My children, whither have you come?" The wife of Pantius, being a tall and robust woman, girded up her robe, and arranged each of the corpses as decently as her means permitted. After she had paid the last offices to each of them, she prepared herself for death, bared her neck, allowed no one to approach her but the executioner, and died like a heroine, without requiring anyone to arrange her corpse. Thus the modesty which she had observed throughout her life did not desert her even when she was dead. Thus, gloriously, even during its last days, did Lacedaemon, whose women are taught to vie with men in courage, prove that virtue is superior to fortune. A few days afterwards, those who were watching the body of Kleomenes, as it hung upon the gibbet, observed a large snake which wound its body round his head and covered his face, so that no ravenous bird could alight upon it. On hearing this, the king was struck with superstitious terror, fearing that he had offended the gods by the murder of one who was evidently a favorite of heaven, and something more than mortal. All the ladies of his court began to offer sacrifices of atonement for his sin, and the people of Alexandria went to the place and worshipped Kleomenes as a hero and child of the gods, until they were restrained by the learned, who explained that, As from the corrupted bodies of oxen are bred bees, from horses wasps, and from asses beetles, so human bodies, by the melting and gathering together of the juices of the marrow, produce serpents. This was observed by the ancients, who therefore considered that of all animals the serpent was peculiarly appropriate to heroes.